thank you for coming on to the podcast today. I think it's very easy to say, looking at your experience across the banking sector, particularly working with Barclays, TSB, CTIO, for that experience to be super interesting, and definitely a conversation I'd be really keen to talk to you about is around your experience and insights working across that space, and particularly from the digital transformation remit. I think my networks will have a lot to learn from your insights and the experience that you have. So we'd love to kind of start this conversation off with a bit of a background around yourself and I guess what digital transformation means to you in the context of banking.
Sure, thank you, Daisy. So overall, 23 years of experience, technology leadership, two big sectors, telco and banking now, 10 years. 8 at Barclays, multiple roles, having been privileged to be part of a very sweet period where there was an absolute alignment, intergalactic alignment of vision to right execs and right mission and right intents. 4 beautiful years of digital transformation, trying to take the banking in the hand of the customer, so to say, and millions of them, starting with web, then mobile, the services. That's where the real magic is, as well as last 4 or 5 years trying to truly walk the talk in terms of hey, we have a lot of data, but exploit it, monetize it, and not only use the data to monetize for the benefit of customer experience, etc., but use it for colleague experience, which is quite a hidden thing, and actually use a lot of data and the technologies available today to reduce the cost burden, i.e. the legacy systems, etc. And then the last 2 years at TSB, trying to build the cloud platform, which is different than to consume the cloud platform. And in all of these, call it 3 broad revolutions, digital, data, and cloud, and now, of course, AI, etc. They're all 3 fundamentals which any business at any point in time has. And the key is to build enduring platforms and connect those platforms together to then drive transformation. So the transformations have been the bedrock of those have been the platforms. And surprise, it's not so much a new news for us, having worked in tech and data and banking, to see the whole fintech. What is fintech? Fintech is really a platform play where everything is offered granularly and you can pick and choose from the menu of choices, etc. So hopefully you get a brief about my background and some of the summary taglines in terms of the transformations I've been part of.
Thank you for that introduction, and really keen to dive into that kind of summary in more depth as we go into this conversation. So talking around vision and leadership, what does a good vision look like to you, and how important is driving the right vision and leadership in digital transformation across the banking sector, which then ultimately helps to tie in data, cloud and digital all in one together?
Sure. So at any point in time, any business has their vision. So vision is quite key because that's the North Star, and that's what keeps you driving towards, and everything falls off from the vision, mission, etc. Big statements, but they're very thought through, and they're never more than 10 words. I think if a vision is more than 10 words, then it loses the simplicity and the absolute focus that you are here for. And a good vision looks like, in, let's say, we're talking a 10-year time frame in a banking. At different times it has changed, but let's say 2014 time frame, another vision was trying to take benefit of the smartphone revolution and the democratization of the whole smartphone technology and trying to go digital. So the vision at that time would be, be digitally available to all of your customers and help them to do day-to-day banking digitally as much as possible. And some would have different versions of it, digital in and out, various versions of it. But the whole point is about the experience that the customer gets is as much as possible on digital channels, and things move quite rapidly. Something which is very normal today was something that, oh, is that even possible of those days? So vision is quite key. It in many ways encapsulates in itself for a period of time end state where you want to go. End state of your customer cohort, colleague cohort, the whole financial side of the business cohort, and even the ESG aspect of things. And so to say, vision changes as well. Right now, strategy hangs off the vision because vision is a statement and strategy is how will you do it in many ways. And strategy also encapsulates in itself, where are you? A true and accurate representation of where you are. If you are misplaced about where you are, under or over, it's an issue. And then where does your vision say where you want to get, where you want to go? So that means an end state. So where you are and where you want to be is essentially what the strategy is. And in many ways, if you talk of the simple questions, why is perhaps coming from the vision. Why should we do it? Strategy is about what. What will you do for the why that you exist for, and then how. How will you do it? Strategy, very literally, means what is your strategy? I mean, if you want to go from place A to B, you have a strategy that I'm going to take tube for a part, I'm going to walk for the other part, I'm going to take bus for the other part. You get the idea. So strategy is what the word says. What is your strategy to reach where you want to reach? And in that sense, then falls on things like, what is the cost benefit? Because it's you cannot have you will not have a strategy, meaning you won't do anything. And you keep sitting idle, then there's no cost to it. There's no incremental cost to it. But to do something different from what you're doing, there's a cost benefit to it, and then there's ROI, etc. for it. And then you work on the timeline. That's what dictates the roadmap. And then you start putting investments into place, and then the programs, transformation programs into place. So that's how I see the vision, strategy, how they're linked together, and how for any enterprise world they're sought at different points in time, they would have the vision and strategy. In fact, it's quite a routine thing to refresh the strategy at least every 3 years, and then you can go specific. You have an overall business strategy, then there will be a technology strategy. Within technology strategy, you'll have a digital strategy, data strategy, infrastructure strategy within which cloud falls. You would have a cyber-sec strategy, and so on and so forth.
And how challenging can it be to ensure that the strategy and the vision is tied in together and everybody follows kind of the same and buys into both the vision and the strategy, especially if you're in an environment where it is changing every few years? I think people can often see change as quite a threatening thing. It's the fear of the unknown. What kind of leader do you need to be to ensure that that can tie in successfully together and people can sort of buy into both?
Sure, buying is absolutely important because not only you need everyone in the enterprise to be doing their part of the strategy, otherwise why do it and how will you do it really, right? So people is a big part of it and the whole culture is a big part of it. In many ways, if vision and strategy are out of kilter with the culture and the people, then it's not going to work anyway. So when the development of vision strategy happens, that's when, of course, a core group from a good sample of the full enterprise spread is taken. Generally, it's the leader of the specific business functions, obviously, because it is a leadership job and it's a top-down job. It's taken, and then by virtue of, let's say if I'm heading a function and if I'm part of a strategy work, 3 to 6 months, then naturally I'm talking about in my leadership and cascade is happening. So while the strategy is being developed, people are in the know at call it the senior leadership level and the cream layer, if you will. But equally, it's a big job to publish the strategy internally, educate every single part of your organization about its onerous, but it has to be. I went to that hotel, I was there for the full day, I enjoyed this, that, the other thing, I enjoyed meeting that individual, the other, but I also discussed the strategy, and it's a one-day commitment investment, and it's a great way to propagate it. And then I've seen more passive methods where you feel, oh, there's always, oh, another, here you go, new strategy by way of new artifacts flowing around, etc. But perhaps that's not a very surgical method. So it's upon the developers of the strategy, the core group, to first of all clearly articulate the message, clearly articulate the why, the end state, what, how, by when, so what, these big questions, and then do it in a way, in a method which is, it sticks. And then, of course, then people can always link, hey, this program that I'm working on, this feeds to that part of the tech strategy, and that feeds to that business outcome of the business strategy. And then people are intelligent enough after that.
And you have your vision, you have your strategy within the banking sector, and we've had conversations around this before. It is, definitely a more complex environment with several different layers included. So how do you then, if you're kind of explaining a banking setup and the kind of the different remits across transformation space within that area, for somebody that's watching who might want to get into the banking space or lead programs within the banking area, how would you split up the different structures internally, and how can you then feed through to those structures the vision and the strategy when there's different structures kind of all running in parallel?
So when you work significant time in any enterprise, right, and if you are a little bit glued on, right, you will very quickly map out the structure. It will vary a little bit, from one to the other. If you pick up the retail banking, let's say in the UK market, the way they'll be structured is very similar, and the structure will be as follows roughly at any place. Traditionally, all banks started from being a product organization, and in this context, the product is the banking product. A current account is a product, savings account is another product, loans is another product, mortgage is another. And if you trace through the history, a lot of the products would have been the different businesses themselves at a point in time, and now suddenly you have a universal bank offering the full spectrum of products, also called as customer needs. What you call current account is the customer need to spend and transact. And what you call saving account is a customer need to save. What you call personal loan is a customer need to borrow. Even mortgage is borrow, but big borrowing, right, based on security, which is the house in this case. And credit card is a borrowing need. If you look at investment is a customer need. I have a surplus and I need to invest. I need to make more yield for my money, etc. Right? So private banking, we call it product, but it's a need of wealthier individuals who just don't have time to do their day-to-day banking, and so on and so forth. So product and needs are two faces of the same coin, where customer has a need which is then serviced as a product by the bank. And in that context, the banks are organized by way of products, and then products are distributed, sold and serviced on channels. Digital is a channel, increasingly a very dominant channel. Traditionally for banks, branches have been the channels, more face-to-face, more congenial and more social and more relationship-based, and in any channel worth its salt, depending on the evolution. But earlier, banks served the full universal needs that I talked about in a branch. Then they siphoned off some of it in contact centers. Then they started automate some of the very mundane ones in the IVR, after which you land into the contact center. And then the digital revolution started, and again, as the channels builds in, it starts with the more mundane, mechanical, easy aspects. So of course, any bank app, when it would have showed up, it would definitely show transaction. It will definitely show the balance, which is the absolute, the low-hanging fruit for a channel to service. But more complex needs, such as digital customer onboarding, when you become a customer for the first time, would have come through as a newer offering. Yeah, and then the story goes on. So at this current time, you have products or customer needs, depending on how you look at it, and the channels in which those needs are serviced or even start. And then there's a continuous engagement layer, which is quite a differentiator, right? When I become the customer, and from then on, when I look at my own balance, I get an experience of how the bank knows me well enough, and that's where the personalization, and that's where how good or bad your app is, or how good or bad your contact center is, how much is the wait time. The whole customer experience really comes into play to have a good view of how engaged the customer, or on both sides. If you engage them more, then they'll stick with you more. Blah blah blah. So that's an area to work. And then there are other things which customers expect from bank: fraud, fin crime, financial crime, and general education about what we call these money confidence at various places. It's almost in the mission statement that we make you more confident, make money work, things like that, things centered around money. And that's all driven through the continuous customer engagement and things like fraud, financial crime, KYC, KYB, etc. Right? And this then forms the whole entirety of a banking business. And then you have, of course, the classic things coming from technology to support it, not just for everything there is at least one or more system, or one or more application, or one or more platform, what language you talk, and you got to maintain them, and you got to continue to build new. Going back to the previous question of strategy and transformation, you continue to build new while maintaining the old and having a cohesive, resilient, stable ecosystem of these. And this then represents the whole organization. And there's enough clarity and more to see the handoff from one organization to the other when you're resident internally in a structure. But from outside, it's also not a rocket science, right? So, banking is such a need that every single individual, fortunately enough, still people excluded from financial access in some societies. But largely speaking, you have a view as to when you go to the branch, what you feel as a customer. So it's not very hard to map out if one really goes for it. In fact, app gives a very good view itself of how would the banking be organized. Keep one thing in mind, right? While a lot of sharing, etc., is a buzzword, is a great thing to have, but you need focus. I'm trying to get into the criticism. Oh, you are broken into silos. Well, silos are very important. If you don't have a silo, you don't get the focus, you don't get the expertise, you don't get the specialism. Not everyone can be a generalist. So there's a mix, it's a cone-like structure. You need to have a veneer of good things cutting across, and those are very generic. They're like thin and white, but you've got to have specialism, and that gives rise to the departments. And ultimately, it's down to the culture, where culture is not so great, there's not so much sharing happening. But if culture is great, having department or silos is not an issue. So hopefully, what I'm trying to say is internally, if you are able to map out enough collateral and more, where you can understand the organization, and even when you are a customer, you can map out, or even interested in banking, there's enough and more material available to understand it. So that's how you map the organization.
So running through and mapping out what banking looks like, and then shifting the focus into digital transformation and the context there. We've previously discussed around the 5 layers within banking for transformation. And before we dive into them in more detail, could you give us an overview of what those 5 layers are and what they include?
Yeah, sure. So, as I can briefly touch, right, transformation is not just a wish, and transformation is anchored on the specific layers, and we talk about banking in that context, and then when you talk of layers, you're going to transform each and every layer to then come up with a, sorry to use the word, but stack view of the transformation, verticalized front to back view of the transformation. Because if any layer is out of kilter and not transformed from what it was, then the end goal will be hard to achieve, or it won't be there in more worse cases. So typically, we did talk about products and distribution channels, etc. And then there's this whole entity of customer. So customer, products, and channels, if those 3 are the big building blocks of a banking business, then in terms of transformation and digital transformation, by saying digital, we are talking technology and systems and data by default, and trying to trying to then achieve the outcomes, because transformation is for a purpose, and typically the transformation has outcomes. One or more of these is to improve the customer experience, or in fact even provide compelling customer experience, something which has not been provided in the past incrementally, but all the while compelling. If it is moving the needle only slightly, then it's not transformation. It's a slow change anyway. So compelling customer experience, great colleague experience. If you don't provide great colleague experience, forget about providing good customer experience, because the non-digital channels where there's still a lot of interactions happen is being serviced by colleagues. And technologists who are putting this whole platforms to transform this whole thing at place, they are your colleague. And if their development experience is not great, then forget about transformation, true transformation. So colleague experience. Third is generation of revenue or growth. That's quite key, because until you see the real money behind this transformation, the customer experience translating into more stickiness, more cross-sell, upsell, i.e. more revenue, more income, what's the point of it? What's the so what of doing all this, right? We're not doing this for academic reasons. And a true transformation by definition starts with a lot of cost efficiencies. People have different words for it. Cost reduction, capacity creation, that's a nice sophisticated word for saying the same thing, I felt, because cost essentially is time and effort, and that's capacity going away. And if you reduce the inefficiency, i.e., of course it shows up in cost, but what it shows up is in capacity. You can do different things. So the objective could say like cost reduction or capacity creation or efficiency or productivity. Many words for essentially the same thing, right? So 4 outcomes are essentially, typically I've seen the transformation outcomes. And then they will not be achieved if you don't transform with those 4 in mind at each layer. What are these layers? First and foremost, customer is the king, keep saying it, and customers interact with you increasingly this day and age with the digital layer. Call it the front end layer, right? For a D2C business, direct to consumer, or even direct to business, B2B business, because businesses and their representatives are interacting with you, the front end layer, the facade, the app, the web, the CRM, which is a combination of the technology and human, right? So that's the front end layer. Second layer is, front end layer is more or less, the least rich of the layers that I'm going to describe. And I'll say why it is so. It's a pass-through layer. Whatever goodness exists beneath will dictate the intelligence of this layer. The layer next is services layer. And services is the guts of a customer experience, colleague experience side of the equation in this. And services where more lately people are talking APIs, but API is just a form of service. But services in the main, broadly, the definition is where the business logic is, where you decide what will you do with 1 plus 1. Where will you go and get the data from, and how will you add it, how will you orchestrate the data that you're getting from your systems downwards, or how are you orchestrating between what is the sequence, the whole intelligence, kind of the whole sequencing of things happen there. And if they are designed properly, then that's where the goodness lies. The layer beneath that is 2 things in parallel, so to say. A lot of the services layer traditionally have pulled the data from or written the data into core systems or legacy systems. And they can be funded from different times in banking context. Broadly, you could say the mainframes. But equally, mainframes are being hollowed out or reduce the dependence on by actually creating new data systems, new data platforms for multiple needs. The big need of data platforms is for analytical usages, BI, MI, in decision making, more passive decision making than programmatic decision making. Then the more new age uses, AI, ML that also writes off data platforms. And then the operational use, which can be pretty much, used simply behind the services layer for even the digital channels. So data is quite broad, and that's why it's a big thing sitting beside core set of systems. And depending on the industry, your core systems could be different. In a telco setup, your core systems are operational support systems, or network systems. In a bank setup, your core systems are core banking, the current account products that I talked about, the actual mortgage product processor is a core system. Fourth layer is the fourth or fifth, because in the third step I described core banking and data almost parallelly. They need not be sitting on top of each other. They are parallel. So the fifth layer is the infrastructure. All of these four things that we talked about, core banking, data platforms, services, and the digital, they all sit on top of infrastructure. Infrastructure had a legacy and now getting into cloud. And there goes your 5 layers of an enterprise stack, and especially that.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to running through them in more detail now and the kind of context in some more depth. So from my experience, I think a lot of the time when you're working with leaders or engineers in general, a lot of the time the priority can be to focus on this cool digital product and build something new and exciting, but without necessarily thinking about the importance of the kind of taking a step back and the processes and the services that go into making that happen. Is this something that you've seen in the past with your experience? And if so, could you sort of tell me some more about that?
Sure, no, it's all the time. I think the theory that I have settled with myself is closer you are to interplay with the customer, more you think you've got the burden of representing the customer, and that plays out even in digital layer, because the first layer that the customer interacts with, and fair enough, they're going to say the app doesn't work. Now, app doesn't work for many reasons, and it's a secondary and tertiary investigation. So you can't have it with both hands, meaning the digital leaders who are responsible for the digital layer cannot but think that they are responsible for the most important aspect because they are representing the customer. But they also have the other side of it. They know fully well that it's not working because of something not making sense beneath, and in that sense they are on the same page. Same is it's consistent in the sense that the other leaders who are representing other layers of the organization also very clear that blaming digital only, if you are blaming, there's a blame situation, then they are not to be blamed. It's the intelligence which is beneath, which has an issue. But good example is when something is running slow. It's hardly that things run slow because of the business logic being processed. Majority of the reason things run slow because it's traversing through many layers. Sometimes quite unnecessarily, sometimes duplicatively, and sometimes using the interfaces and the methods which are less modern than they can be. And in many ways, the actual root cause is hidden, and then the digital layer gets blamed. So digital layers take the disproportionate blame and disproportionate credit as a result, and in many ways can sometimes create some asymmetry in the organization. But the reality is, every layer has a role to play. It has a concern to address in a good way, implementing good design patterns, etc. But talking of digital layer, they should absolutely be concerned if the experience layer. When I'm going to talk about services, I'm going to talk about what is the experience in a little bit more detail. But the experience is that layer where customer is interacting with screens, things on the screens, validations on the screens. The moment you're talking of data, you're traversing through the layer, and the concern shifts to the other layers.
Thank you. It's really interesting. And moving into the services layer, and talking about experience, can you sort of dive into that in some more depth and explain how that entwines with the digital side?
Sure. So services very broadly is all learned experience, and it's quite an interesting one. I think Bach has propagated. I can talk publicly about it. That when we say services, these days we say APIs, but there can be 3 types of API with 3 different concerns. And just to keep the frame of customer and the 5 layers that we said, now we're talking of digital layer, and digital layer interacts with the services. Services itself can be broken further down into three types of services or three types of APIs. First, at the top is the experience API. And the concern of experience API is it's just sitting the layer beneath the screens. And its big concern is, depending on what is the data coming from the bottom layers, what experience should be given to the customer. Now, what is experience in this context? Is the text, is the image, is the video that should be shown. If it is an error, how should you word the error? A good example is earlier days when you used to do a lot of mainframe-based digital banking. Mainframe would have a monthly upgrade, and during that time, you need to show appropriate error. Not that the whole bank is down. So that translation, that what sort of service you're providing at that particular time, is the concern of the experience layer. If, let's say, you're not able to retrieve your statements, but rest of the things are working at the time, what should the message be? So call it, how should you deal with the detail coming from the bottom layer? How should that you translate into a customer-friendly manner is the concern of experience API. The second API is where the big meat is. It's a big layer of API, process API. And process API is the real big guy. It's a big brother in the whole three-layer APIs. And it's the master. It's there where the real intelligence is. Process API's job is to do a few things. Is to bring in the data from what I'm going to describe later. Is to aggregate the data if it needs to be. Is to sequence. I need to pull what products the customer holds based on the customer number, then get into the detail of the transaction of each product. You see there are three steps here.
Yeah.
For the customer, get the product. For a product, get the transaction. This is an orchestration, and this will be the job of a process API. And it does many other jobs, like filtering and very, very, very many other things. But this is where the meat lies. And the last layer of API, which is also significant, is what we call data API or system API. It's this API which directly interacts with the layer that we will deep dive in the next question, is the data layer. The data API can interact with also the layer that I position parallelly to data platforms, the core banking layer or the core layer if it is any other industry. So, for summary, three types of services. Experience API closer to customer or closer to digital. Process API, the real big guy, the real captain of this whole service layer. And the data API, which is actually getting the essential discrete piece of information from the relevant set of systems.
Do you find that these different APIs and the different layers can often be quite siloed, because I'd imagine it would be quite essential for them to be sort of conjoined so that everybody is working towards going back to like the vision and the strategy to kind of avoid different kind of strategies, different decision makings? Do you find that they're set up in that way?
It's a great question. I think it's good that you asked that question, because the three layers that I described, the ownership to have their roadmap as such is actually in the right places. And those right places are three different places. Any layperson can call them silo, but I personally don't call them silo. I lean towards that you must get something done where it is best to get done. Who understands about customer experience API better than the one who provides the customer experience itself by way of the screens? So I know how to, if you remember how I explained experience API, what message should be given to customer is best understood by the digital guys. What process, now process and that's why in many cases, because you're talking this is all in digital context, experience API is developed by digital teams. They also develop the screens, so they know it better. They are closest to it. Process API, because this is a pervasive example we're giving, process could be any process. It could be customer onboarding process. And in that sense, the process API should be by the actual customer teams. There are teams where I gave the frame of customer, product, and channels. Think of the customer. I think a better example is if the process is an onboarding process, then the head of acquisitions, of mortgages, of personal loans, of cards, have better say in it. Because what do they want? Which APIs do they want and which systems do they want from which they want to collect the data when they want to onboard the customer? A mortgage customer is very different from if it is a first-time customer, very different from a credit card customer. You would like to connect to and collect very many elements for a mortgage customer than for a credit card customer, because mortgage is the very most comprehensive product that bank sells. It's the most complex product as well. So you get the idea. So process APIs are closer to where the journey is originating from. Is it a mortgage journey in the main? Is it a lending journey in the main? Is it just a servicing journey in the main? You get the idea. And the third is data API or systems API, again close to where they must be. APIs or services are simply again a representation of the core system which holds the data. It's just a layer, it's just a door. Yeah? It's a mechanism to access the stack view, and it will serve very many needs of customer and the representatives from the three silos, you can call them, but they work in conjunction, come together.
So running through the digital layer, the services layer, and I know you've briefly touched on the data layer with regards to the APIs. How do banks deal with moving away from old sort of data systems and processes and moving into new ones in the context of transformations?
Yeah, much of the hard bit and thereby much of the moving the needle lies in this particular part of the transformation because of multiple reasons. One is there's a lot riding on it. If you do it well, then you can move away a bit closer to moving away from hard to maintain, costly to maintain, older technology, skill sets are hard to find, etc. And secondly, you get closer to exploitation. Data is the new oil and all of that, and analytics, AI, what have you, right? So there's a lot riding on this part of it. And it's also complex because while data is the data, but the interpretation of it is very nuanced, and it comes with years of experience and having used the same attributes in different contexts for different meanings. And that's where the proportionality of interpreting the value of a field is much more overloaded in this context. In other words, if a customer balance could mean very many different things in the different contexts, right? So what I mean by that is, if your balance is let's say good, then are you good for a investment product? If your balance is less, then are you good for an overdraft product? So it has interpretation, and I'm just giving very rudimentary examples, but the same value of balance has different applications, and that's where the subject matter expertise comes from. So absolutely, I mean, when we say core banking modernization, let's take a step back. What are we saying? Core banking does a fantastic job, has done it the way it is. And broadly, I'll describe the version of core banking where go back to the previous version, the previous answer, where there's customer systems, product systems, and channel systems. And for customer and products, traditionally all banks have various mainframes. And mainframe itself is a multi-layer architecture within it, but broadly it's an API and the database there. And when we say core banking modernization, what we're saying is the data sitting in the databases behind mainframes is elsewhere now. Yeah, and the whole life cycle management, let's say current account product, in the very simply put, current account product is about money going in, money going out. Yeah, but there are lots of things. It's like layers of an onion that gets built around this whole credit debit thing. And that what constitutes a current account management system. You can build that system, newly, completely grounds up, and these days in a cloud native way. But it's easier to say, hard to implement, because over the years that the IBM mainframe has been in place, all the processes, all the tools, all the everything else in the enterprise, all the decisions have been using the data set the way it has been. So not only you will move the data and the APIs on the data in a new platform, but you will have to move every single process journey with respect to customer and colleague from the new setup. That's where lies the challenge. Otherwise, just theoretically speaking, you can always move. But in the end, it's not an undoable thing, and people are doing it. So basically, the whole core banking bundle set of system is being unbundled. More granularly, people are chipping away in terms of implementing in the new age. But why I'm giving this long-winded story is the new set of data platforms, if they're built properly with access layer, they can do the job, the main job of the core banking, product processing, because it's all about the product information, pricing information, billing information, metering information, and in these days of analytics and AI, giving the right product recommendation to the customer. All of these can be built ground up in a cloud native stacked way. And if you don't have too much legacy, don't have too much to risk, then people are building that. But yes, I mean, these two layers exist together. If your data layer is not as sophisticated as it can be, then you're as farther from core banking modernization as you can be.
And do you still see a lot of legacy data within that kind of structure, or is it now kind of entirely cloud native? Or I know obviously there's a lot of shift from migrating away from legacy and going to cloud native. Like, how does that look now after a good few years of huge migration projects to move away from the legacy stuff? Is there still kind of a lot there that you see?
There's a lot, and depending on the appetite and very many factors, do you even want to move off of your legacy? Keep in mind a few things. I think the horse is your business model. That's the horse. How you achieve your business model by way of legacy or by way of cloud native is almost a cart, right? So if you're not fundamentally change your business model, then there's perhaps no need. Depends how big cost is for you as well. When we say business model, cost to income ratio is a big part of it. And if the cost is being driven largely by legacy, which is actually the reality of many places, then that becomes the driver. Then necessarily change your business model. So you modernize from legacy to a new set of cloud native systems or more data exploitation because you want to reduce cost, not necessarily change your business model, not necessarily offer banking in a completely different way. That's a fintech business model. Yeah. So it is useful to differentiate between a bank's business model versus a fintech business model. A bank's business model is very obvious to know, is a net interest margin based business model. We make money on deposits and we give we charge higher interest rates than we give on deposits, and it's the difference between the interest, which is the main source of income for banks. But fintech business model is their main product itself is the platform. Their main product is to sell the granularity of data and granularity of service, and then offer the Lego blocks to companies like banks. Yeah. So business models are very different, and that's why fintech industry calls banks complacent, but I don't think so. I mean, it's just that banks knows their business. That's why after pandemic, with higher interest rate, etc., banks are doing wonderfully well because it's a net interest margin. Equally, it has its own challenges, but that's not the point of topic here. So I don't think it may be a very big statement to make. I don't ever see a world, despite the technology disruptions of a traditional bank, universal banks, with so much risk, etc., and with not so much impact on the business model, truly the business model. I'm not saying cost needs to be reduced, But cloud native or not is not going to change the way banks do business. In other words, they will still be in the net interest margin business. Yeah, and in that sense, it can only affect the cost and the customer experience and the productivity, etc., etc. And this is not to say you should not do it, but I don't see a place where there will be no legacy. There is no such thing. It's much the same. The telco context 20 years ago. Will the voice be dead? Well, voice is not dead. Just that the cost to offer voice is being recovered from the customer from the cost of data. We pay for broadband, but in which the telcos recover the cost of voice. Yeah. So similar context here. The legacy mainframes will be there. They'll do the job, but you can always hollow out. And there are examples. Operational data store, etc., is a good example, and Barclays has implemented it at big scale. All of the data that is needed in digital channels, the read data does not come from mainframe, but comes from operational data stores. And in that sense, you reduce the cost of acquiring mainframes and mainframes alone. So it's not binary. Legacy will be there for the purpose that it solves and for the master purpose that it solves. But everything else, where you're simply reading the data, you can read it from more cheaper, more scalable platforms.
I think the last layer that we haven't touched on so much as of yet is around the infrastructure layer. Could you explain, obviously now we've got a good insight into like the complexities, the layers, and that's also across different regions as well. So how can banks transform infrastructure across those regions?
Sure. So as I described, I think, in the beginning few questions, everything that we spoke, the multiple layers, they all are deployed on infrastructure. Now, when we say infrastructure, it's a big word, but let's break it down. Infrastructure is made up of 4 big things in my view: compute, storage, and think of infrastructure. Your laptop is an infrastructure. It gives you the RAM that you have. It has a certain hard disk. And there goes the story. So compute, storage, network, which is more involved and more, geographical aspects come to it as well as security. And treat security more broadly. There's security at every layer. There's security in the network layer, there's storage security, there's compute security, there's application security. And when we say infrastructure, I'm differentiating from the applications. Fair to say that all what we talked, core banking, data, services, or digital. All 4 are applications. There are different types of applications, but applications need infrastructure. And infrastructure is further broken down to compute, storage, network, and security. And then security is also at an application level. But in this case, we'll talk about the They have the infra for it. So personally, I have a more acute opinion here. Trying to dwell too much on how you should have an infrastructure play is a bit of a waste of time. I think the answers are out there. The question though is, how do you bring it and live in the context of your strategy, enablement? How well are you exploiting this essentially a commodity? Commodity is not to do disrespect. Commodity is simply say that you need not focus as much time and energy that you're focusing on it. There's other core areas for you. For a bank, infrastructure can give you a lever. Infrastructure can help you in the big ticket items, resilience. Resilience, it is so much expected of banks, but it's not yet there. Of course, they have like 4-9 services for the big services, but in its entirety, there's a lot of resilience story. Resilience will still to happen. Stability, the whole feeling, the whole risk aversion in banks come from the whole lack of stability. So it can make you feel stable. The whole capacity. There are hundreds and thousands of people across applications teams, platforms teams, organizations focused on the continued getting the capacity ready in a very mechanical way if you don't have a private cloud or a public cloud offering, which is hardly the case these days. But even when you have private and public cloud, there is a lot of concern on capacity. So capacity is quite key. So what I'm saying is platform as a service, just the infra platform as a service, and software as a service. Salesforce is a good example of SaaS. Gmail is for common people. Adobe is a good example of SaaS. But then just having a node with certain compute and certain storage is the other end of the spectrum, which is the IaaS. But answer lies in having all three, not 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 swinging too much onto one side. Because if you talk of good applications these days, they must be containerized, they must be on Kubernetes. It's basically the leader in container runtimes, and they are offered as a platform by AWS, etc. Very many analytics use cases are being offered as platforms. That's a midway in between. If you want to do CRM, if you want to do a lot of good marketing, etc., you rather lean towards SaaS, Salesforce, Adobe marketing with their SaaS solutions. And if you just want to build a application stack within yourself, you could simply use the low cost end of these cloud providers in IaaS. And coming to network, and if you talk of cybersecurity, much of the new offerings by the big players, Palo Alto, Zscaler, Netscope, etc., they're all SaaS offerings, and they try to offer everything in one single implementation, single pane of glass, and from the highest or the most abstract view to the most detailed view, the monitoring, alerting, everything is kind of built in. It's the SaaS age these days. Same with network, the whole box view of the network or the device view of the network is being unpicked, and network as a service is the new buzzword. So summary is between IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, network as a service, and a lot of cybersec solutions themselves as SaaS, these days going to as a service model is a no-brainer for the objectives of resilience, stability, capacity, elasticity. And if you've done the first chapter of this, then you can, sky's the limit in terms of leveraging for AI workloads, for LLMs, etc. They're all being provided by these big players. Again, quantum computing, go for it, be my guest. They have the workloads being ready for that. If you're geographically distributed across jurisdiction, data residency requirement, they have a cloud for that. You name it and you have it. Then why waste time? So that's my view on the whole infrastructure aspect. Go cloud.
And with the service model, would you say that most banks out there are pushing towards that or have done already, or do you see?
No, already would be a great news to hear. I think a good way to describe it in the process. Now, process itself is a big word. Where are you in the process is a question. It's a more self-reflection than me sitting here and commenting, I think. Again, right? How long have we been talking digital, right? We're talking digital at least, very explicitly since Apple released 2007, right? At least since 16 years. Is it complete by any means? No. It's much the same case with cloud. There are claims on either side that we're too much legacy. That's also a claim. We have too much cloud. Cloud native is a nirvana still, because cloud native only happens when the greenfield things happens. If something is brownfield, well, there are only parts of it which will be cloud native. So, but I guess it's not an issue. It's not necessary to get a label. I think what is important is, are you comfortable in where you want to be in the next 3 years? Beyond 3 years, the horizons are very blurred to take any significant book of work as a committed book of work. You can keep talking about things and you can be directional about it. But I have a firm belief that any view more than 3 years it's just, blue sky thinking, it's fluffy, and you can't talk much about it. And with that context, enterprises are somewhere very close to fully being on cloud. Very few will be there. In fact, none will be there properly if they have been a 20 years plus business. If they are at a history, they cannot be fully cloud native. And equally, if they have 20 years plus history, they would have some sort of a legacy. A thing becomes legacy in 3 years or 5 years. Right? So the answer is in between, but the thing is, it doesn't bother me because you don't have to have a label. I don't think any places I work, I'll call them a legacy place or a cloud native place. I won't call them either. I don't know. It's somewhere in between. But that's not an issue because we are delivering on the business outcomes. You see the point.
And just a last question from me on that. So you mentioned around 3 years thinking is kind of too far away and it's very fluffy. I think I've often seen the pattern working with the bigger enterprise, the banks, where a lot of transformation programs and processes will be a 3 to 5 year plan because of the scale and the complexities. How can you shrink that down, and what do you think is a good time frame in order to achieve?
Yeah, in this podcast we talked about things like vision, mission, and all that, right? And then we also talked about the nuts and bolts of, let's say, I think the services layer, even in the nuts and bolts. You see, there is an immediate dissonance of it in that sense, talking both the things in the same breath. What do I mean by that? A vision could be a 5-year vision. A strategy, 5-year strategy is perhaps too long. 3 years is a good strategy because then you are not being fast enough. Or you have not just studied enough that you cannot have a view of where you want to be in 3 years. Well, go deeper, work more, right? But 3 years is also a good sweet spot for many reasons. And I'll throw in some more unorthodox reasons, unheard of reasons, or maybe when I say it, it's obvious. I've also seen these things are top down by the nature of it, right? Vision, strategy, they are big things, and these are day jobs of CEOs, expos, etc. And in my view, the life cycle of a significant leader is you would be glad that if it is 3+ years. That's how the things change and variables change, and it's not about individuals and positions and the businesses. It's just the way it is, and for example. And then the very many external factors. Who would have thought that pandemic would come 3 years before 2020? Nobody. After pandemic, who would have thought that there was a bit of an expectation that high inflations and cost of income, but who would have thought about Ukraine war? Because frankly, Putin has had an issue since 2014, so nobody thought about that. And then when this came, who would have thought about, in a very positive way, the ChatGPT breakthrough last year? Because AI has been always there, right? So there are good and bad happening in less than 3 years of time frame, big global factors, which then change, and then you overlay the factor of the shelf life of the big execs, and that's the way the market rolls. And I picked up many roles where you learn in the first year, you put things into place in the second year, and from the third year, it does not matter how good you do, there's always more criticism than there is claps for it. It's just the way these things run, and for that reason, 3 years gives you a sweet spot to drive for a thing and define a finite thing, mobilize the workforce, execute. You'll never make, that's how world works, right? You always achieve less than the target. But if the target is high enough, then you still have achieved less, you've achieved a good target if that gives a drift. And 3 years sweet spot because it keeps the teams energized, it's not long enough, and yet it is finite enough, you can visualize it and then achieve it, then feel great about it. And then I already talked about the global factors, top management, dynamism, and as well as global factors. These things are going to change the business any which way in more than 3 years. So why bother?
And it seems to be the biggest risks are those that you would never see come in or would never predict. Like you mentioned, COVID-19 and the conflict in war, and so it's always a kind of challenge and never something that you can necessarily always prepare for. But I guess, is there any measures that you can put in place to reduce the risks or reduce to be better equipped to manage those unforeseen circumstances that do come up?
No, of course. So the big mitigation is awareness. Awareness is always helpful, but everything is a function of time and effort and focus. It's good to be generally aware, but I joke about this about economists. I'm not an economist. I went to B school, but I've good primary understanding of economics. You'll find economists never agree, right? So it's like you can be aware, but we're talking of enterprise, we're talking of strategy, we're talking of genuine work. We're not talking of armchair conversations. When it comes down to genuine work, awareness by itself doesn't help. It's good to be aware, but to bring into action, you can only work with finite things when you're taking action. And for things to be finite, more than 3-year time frame, in the context we're talking, there are very many factors that will change. Just the skill set, it will be great if you can have an engineer on an application for 3 years. I have not seen that. And there goes the point, right? So the most granular doer for these things. A transformation is a big word, but it's achieved by collection of thousands of motivated engineers working on that one function, on that one algorithm, on that one thing. And they'll not be there for 3 years, for one thing, because human mind is much more craving for much more variety and much more dynamism than that. Only machines can do that. It's in many ways fascinating that if you have AI for where human beings want to just have that running and not being tied to it, AI can wonderfully augment that without any complaints. Machines don't complain. So to have any intellectual on a mission for 3 years is hard anyway. And for that reason, you can mitigate very broadly big factors, awareness, horizon scanning, very many tools for that. But the issue with this mitigation, I'm double clicking, you can theoretically mitigate. When you set out a plan, it's the plan that you set out. I'm not overstrayed by this whole agile thing. Even agile cannot be changed. A roadmap cannot be changed quicker than 3 months. Because then everything else has to change, the sprints that have been planned, etc. So people have to talk some relevance, right? So it's good to have mitigation, but it's not practical to practice that mitigation at every level.
Thank you for running through that and all the insights that you shared today. I think if anybody needs a kind of guidebook on how to understand, how banks work, how they operate, and how to sort of, run strategy and visionary leadership, this is definitely a podcast to have a listen to. And I've definitely learned a lot, so I really appreciate your time. Just to kind of finalise, is there anything else that you would be keen to cover, or just to kind of share in summary with anybody that's watching?
No, absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the opportunity. It's quite a setup. My message to anyone who's listening or further interested is, my request is there's a lot to get overwhelmed about, but I think it's once you put your head into it, it's easy to understand. The key thing that I tell to myself is not to be overwhelmed with so much going on. And equally, while so much is going on, if you put your time and effort into it, they're very easy to understand as well. These revolutions are coming up with very easy to learn, almost free many of the times, things, and it's only a matter of time and intent to go as much deep. While things are increasing in volumes, they're actually reducing in complexity is a great thing about. And my father will never get as digital literate, but I wonder someday he's talking about AI to me when I call him. So my plea is that don't get overwhelmed. Spend some time and it will make sense. And things are not complex. In fact, people are spending a lot of effort to make it simple. So latch on to that. But apart from me, if you're further interested, you can reach out to me on my LinkedIn page. And I don't spend too much time deliberating in terms of having conversations. So we'll perhaps have a conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on. And for anybody that's enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. I'll share Himanshu's details in the below link. And thank you for watching.